Hello, Dave Hurwitz here at ClassicsToday.com, here to talk about critical editions because they are all the rage now. I'm sure you'll often see recordings that claim to be using a critical edition, but it's important to understand what a critical edition really is and why nobody plays from critical editions or uses them. A critical edition essentially is a score, often an or-text score, that is, the composer's original manuscript, about which the editors, scholars, surround an editorial apparatus that discusses all of the things that may have gone into creating that manuscript, all of the different options the composer may have chosen in putting it together, and thus all of the options the performer would have in playing it. There is a big difference between a critical edition and what performers actually do, which necessarily is a practical performing edition. And many critical editions can't be performed, at least as the way they're written, because it would be simply impractical for many, many reasons. And we'll talk about some of those. I'm going to talk about a bunch of different critical editions because they raise different issues in the musicological field and also directly impact what we hear and also some of the nonsensical claims that performers make about them. And it's really very important to understand whether or not the edition itself really should determine whether we care about what the performers may or may not do. The first kind of critical edition, or edition in general, that I think we should discuss is one where a scholarly apparatus is used to publish music that's never been published before, or to try and bring together the work of a composer all in one place in a systematic way, in a way that has never been done before. One excellent example of that is this. This is the CPE Bach Complete Edition, published by the Packard Humanities Institute. This is a beautiful edition of music, a lot of which was only available in manuscript during CPE Bach's time. A lot of it was published by CPE Bach himself, but those prints are necessarily old and need some updating in terms of their style and editorial principles. And so this is really the first complete edition of the works of CPE Bach, a major, major scholarly undertaking and an important one for music historically, as well as to create practical performance editions for the players. Now the Packard Humanities Institute is doing this in the best possible way because they have these volumes. This is the keyboard sonatinas from manuscript sources. This is not a performance edition. What they're doing is publishing these hardbound volumes of the music for study purposes, and then in addition, they are making available for free on their website practical performance material for musicians who want to play the music from the edition. And that's the way it really ought to be done, because that addresses the twin issues of creating, first, an accurate text, and second of all, giving performers the material they need to actually play the music. Another example of a really necessary critical edition is this, that's here. This is the Gluck complete works. Now, Gluck wrote tons of music, but we only play, Orfeo and Eurydice and a couple other pieces like that. Out of all of his operas, we do one or two out of a few dozen. And it's really a very interesting thing to hear, how he reused music, what he did where, and also to arrive at an accurate text, which was very, very difficult because with Gluck, all that existed is, performance material, and most of his manuscripts have disappeared entirely. So the job of finding and establishing an accurate text was a major undertaking. This thing here is, it's The Marriage of Hercules and Hebe, Le Nozze d'Ercole e d'Ebe. So the Gluck edition is another one where people are doing yeoman work. This is also the case with Rossini and Verdi, both of which were being edited under the auspices of the great Italian opera scholar Phil Gossett, who passed away a couple of years ago quite suddenly. He became ill. It was very, very sad. He was a force of nature and I have to give a shout out to him also for supporting my work in vibrato and performance practice issues. He was very, very positive and encouraging about it. Gossett had a very sensible view of these things because Italian operas particularly, only existed in manuscript. Most of them were not published, and they only exist in practical performance parts, which were changed over the years to adapt to various performance situations. Therefore, there was a real need to go back to the composer's original manuscripts and see what they actually wrote. And most of the time, we really didn't know. And it can be an extremely complicated process. But having done that, Gossett also understood that that did not mean that the critical edition was a practical performance edition, because this being opera and this being the theater, he knew that the music would be adapted. It would be adapted to whatever circumstances arose. And therefore, his editions, especially of Rossini, included a lot of the different options that existed in Rossini's day, as well as revisions and emendations that were made to the scores or made for specific singers. Rossini himself was opposed to a critical edition of his scores in his lifetime because he was afraid that people would discover what he reused, because of course he took the good music from the operas that failed and reused it in new operas that didn't fail, and he didn't want anybody looking into that. Now, of course, we have no reason not to start looking into it, and Rossini has nothing to fear from the process. But the editions of Italian operas that Philip Gossett and his team, were putting out and continue to put out were critically important to establishing definitive texts of just what those operas were. That does not mean, I have to start putting them back here, that that's what is actually going to be played in a performance. It will serve as the basis for what is played. Now, the Haydn Complete Edition is an example of a composer, most of whose work either was never published or was completely unknown. It's really sort of fascinating considering how famous Haydn was. There were certain works, the quartets and some of the symphonies that we know that existed mostly in sort of corrupt editions that were not supervised by Haydn. And so it was quite necessary to go back wherever possible to his manuscripts and publish this music in clean, correct copies for the very first time. I mean, there's nothing critical in the sense that it needed to be fixed. It just needed to be published. And that was a major undertaking. This is volume 2 of the piano trios, works that were as good as unknown until, the latter half of the 20th century. So you can see how helpful that was. But then things become a bit more controversial when you get into the later, for some reason, the later Romantic period. This is the Carl Nielsen edition, and this is Symphony number 5. Yes, Symphony number 5. Now, I happened to be in Copenhagen when this edition was in process and had an opportunity to speak to the editors, and they were very proud of the fact that they were going back to Nielsen's original pencil manuscripts before anything had been done to the symphonies as a result of performance and other factors, because his scores were changed as a result of this, and the editions that were published don't always reflect the original score. But the question is this: if those changes were made, especially by Emile Temagny, his son-in-law, who was a conductor, and they were done with his knowledge, possibly with his approval, quite probably with his approval, and they became the actual performance tradition during his lifetime, does it make sense for a critical edition to leave them out and not even to tell us about what they were? I have real issues with this edition because they feel that by going back to the urtext, they're doing Nielsen justice, when in reality, the score, that is, the work itself, is more than just what he originally wrote. It's the result of his subsequent experience of performing the music and any adjustments or revisions he may have made or approved or sanctioned. And it seems to me that a critical edition has an obligation to tell us what those were so that we can take them into account. And then it's up to the performers to accept them or reject them as on purely artistic or musical grounds. Unfortunately, that's often not what happens. Next, we have the Sibelius edition, the new Sibelius edition. Now, Sibelius is another composer who never had a critical edition, so it's wonderful to have it. It's not terribly necessary for the works that we know well, the symphonies and major tone poems. They were always published in correct scores during Sibelius's own lifetime, more or less correct. And so the need in the case of Sibelius is to publish a lot of the less known music, but also what's getting published, and this is another philosophical issue, is here, for example, this is the early versions of the Lemminkainen legends. You know, Sibelius was an inveterate reviser, and he cleaned up all of his scores before publication, but the early versions still exist. Now, you know, these have been recorded, these early versions, they're on BIS, and you know, performers have a choice. They can play them if they want to. The question is, should they? When a composer has gone through the trouble of revising and cleaning up his scores, does it make sense? Is it right? Is it fair? Does it do him justice to publish his first thoughts and do it on a level which is equivalent to his final thoughts that he actually authorized, supervised, and endorsed? It's a tricky question. It can't be answered in a blanket sort of way. It sort of has to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. I happen to think that Sibelius's revisions to the Lemminkainen suite were all good, and nobody should play the earlier versions. Well, having heard them, they're patently inferior to what he did later. And there are something like 4 or 5 versions of the Oceanides and a whole bunch of things like that. And I don't think any purpose is served other than scholarly inquiry, you know, by publishing and performing these things. I really don't. Or maybe you listen to them once and then you never have to do it again. But these are all being published. They're all being put out there and let to, you know, on the basis of, well, one thing is as good as the other. Well, that's not really true. That's not true to the facts, and it's not true to the composer's intentions. So then, who does the critical edition serve? Does it serve the composer and the composer's intentions, or does it serve the publisher and the publisher's intentions? And that's an issue we shall get to very, very shortly, because the truth of the matter is that many critical editions only exist to keep works in copyright. This is true of Beethoven, Mozart, you know, composers who've been out of print forever, but who are always published in reasonably decent, reliable editions that have been used for generations, recorded for generations. Everyone is happy with them. It's not a problem. Does it really matter if a slur was put over the wrong note or an accent was misplaced? You know, because not only, I mean, look at Beethoven, for example. I mean, his stuff has been published and republished a million times. It costs nothing to do a critical edition in the sense that, yes, you have to pay for the editorial work, but the music itself is public domain. So anybody can go and look at his manuscripts, and anybody can make their own edition based on whatever editorial principles they want. And if a major publisher decides to give it their sanction, then the thing is back in print. Orchestras have to use the latest parts. You know, they want to be au courant with whatever edition they're using. And as a result of that, voila, royalties come back to the publisher. Sometimes they go, if the composer is not too recently dead, to the family of the composer. That's true of Mahler and Sibelius and some others, Rachmaninoff, for example. You know, so there's a great amount of pressure to do these types of editions because they keep music in copyright. That is a purely financial issue. And, you know, scholarship, there may be some, it may be good scholarship, who knows? But let's not kid ourselves as to why these things are being done. And not only are the critical editions of composers such as Beethoven basically pointless, but the fact of the matter is that in performance, for example, of an orchestral score, you won't hear 99% of what has supposedly been fixed because the players are going to do what the players are going to do. You don't know, for example, that a conductor is going to observe every tie or every slur, or that a sforzando that's been shoved off a bar or changed from a sforzando to a rinforzando to something else, or to a hairpin, to, you know, that a forte becomes a mezzo forte. These things all happen rapidly in performance, and chances are we'll never notice most of them. But such editions can actually put music back into copyright and make it more expensive. and make somebody's retirement more comfortable. Now, most of these editions have talked about going back to composers' original intentions, but there's a whole other issue with respect to the Mahler stuff. Now, here's the stupid edition of the Sixth Symphony, where the inner movements have been changed to reflect the fact that in Mahler's only performances, I think there were only 3 of them that he did or so, very few of the Sixth Symphony, he always played the Andante first, even though he published it with the Scherzo first. This edition is a joke. It's that simple. There is no way to know what Mahler's final intentions were. And if they were fair about it, and I've discussed this in my discussion of Mahler 6, so I'll just get over it quickly here. They would have said, do what you want. This is what Mahler did. But the crazy thing about it is that there is a published text. There are also subsequent revisions in Mahler's handwriting. So what a real critical edition ought to have done would be to present performers with all of the possible options and allow them to create a sensible performing edition, which is what these folks do not do. They take the position that their way is the right way, and that is the wrong way to do a critical edition, as far as I'm concerned. It's an injustice to the composer, especially one such as Mahler, who died when he was young and who can never really have been said to have finished anything because he was an active performing musician who was constantly revising his music. Therefore, we need to know what the last thing he did was and what the prior choices were. And then we have to decide where he was in the process of revision and what the options are. These are things that performers need to decide if they're serious. And obviously, as far as Mahler goes at least, we need to have a practical performing edition, which this pretends to be. So it's not really a critical edition. What it is a practical performing edition that takes a certain position or perspective. And frankly, from that perspective, it is no better than your decision or my decision or anyone else's decision. There is nothing scholarly about what these people are telling you to do from a practical performance perspective. It's all just a matter of taste and judgment. And they haven't given performers all of the facts they need, I believe, to make their own informed decisions. And the worst possible case of this disaster of critical editions is Bruckner. It's almost impossible to know where to start. This is such a mess. What the Bruckner people have done, because Bruckner really only wrote, as we know, 9 symphonies that we care about, plus 0 and double 0 if you care about those. The bottom line with Bruckner is that the critical edition is taking the perspective that A, everything he did originally is what should be published, and B, everything he did finally is what should be published, and C, everything he did in the middle should also be published. And the result is a disaster of conflicting editions and choices. It's a nightmare for performers. It's horrible for audiences. And not only are they basing what they did on Bruckner's manuscripts and Bruckner's manuscripts as amended by his colleagues and friends later on in his life, they are also going back to what he thought about doing, what he might have done. I mean, the William Kerrigan version of the Second Symphony with the scherzo before the slow movement reflects what Bruckner originally thought of, but he changed it. He never played it. It never got published that way. It's the original concept. I mean, and then there's that version of the Eighth Symphony he did with the intermediate concept. None of this stuff got played. None of it saw the light of day. It should never, ever, ever have become part of a critical edition. At best, it could be a supplement to a scholarly edition for purely academic purposes. But the idea that all of these things are equally valid, performable, legitimate editions flies in the face not only of what Bruckner himself did, but of what makes sense to best propagate and preserve his legacy in a way which is comprehensible to listeners and relatively easy for performers to understand and to play. It's just insane what these people are doing. And why are they doing it? Well, it's keeping them in business, isn't it? It gives the Bruckner Society something to do. Bruckner is not a composer who wrote so much music that it makes sense to have multiple ongoing editions. He's not like CPE Bach, where you can do, 200 volumes, or one of these composers who wrote lots and lots of music that has never been printed. Bruckner's early music, his which is almost entirely religious and somewhat uninteresting, nobody cares about. So the music that he cares about, if we're limited to 9 scores, they've already gone through 2 critical editions, and there's no sign that it's ever going to stop. Even though he's gone, even though he's dead, even though that there's no point in continuing. What really ought to happen with the Bruckner folks and the Mahler folks, as far as I'm concerned, is that having done their work, they should simply disband. And if somebody has something interesting to say as a result of subsequent research, they can publish a paper. I mean, there's no need for all of this stuff, but it's creating lots and lots of copyright and lots of excuses to keep these people busy. And I think, frankly, it's appalling. But anyway, that is my sort of brief overview on the history of critical editions, Chez Dave, if you want to call it that, but just basically some of what's going on and what we're looking at when we're talking about critical editions versus performance editions versus scholarly editions, how the scholarship impacts the critical editions, whether you're looking at composers' first thoughts or last thoughts or something in between, and what decisions have to be made. And as you can see, every case is individual. There has to be some sort of principle behind what's being done, and ultimately, the ultimate principle ought to be, but sometimes really gets lost in the shuffle, is to serve the best interests of the composer, to represent what the composer did with the greatest clarity and practicality. And I wish that that's what they all did. Some of them do, and they're magnificent, but a lot of them don't. And as a result of that, we have to pay the consequences as listeners. Thank you, folks, and keep on listening.